A little girl alone on a darkened street, her small voice crying for help, but no one listens. A trusted figure in uniform approaches, but instead of safety, he brings terror. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this gripping story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you're moved by Maya's journey for justice, don't forget to subscribe. The evening sky was painted with streaks of orange and deep purple as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. The city hummed with the faint sounds of car horns and hurried footsteps. Street vendors were calling out their final sales, and the faint glow of neon signs started flickering to life. In the midst of the urban noise, a small figure emerged. Maya, a bright-eyed 9-year-old, carefully clutched the straps of her pink backpack as she walked through the crowded streets. The day had been full of joy at the local community center, where Maya and her friends played games, sang songs, and shared stories. A soft smile danced on her lips as she replayed those moments in her mind. "Just remember, Maya," her father's deep voice echoed in her head. "If you ever feel lost, stay calm and retrace your steps. You're a brave girl. You've got this." Her father's words gave her comfort, and Maya had always believed them. She knew the way home. She'd walked it before, familiar murals painted on alley walls, the flower shop with its bright red awning, and the buzzing bakery on the corner. These landmarks had been her guides every time. But today was different. As Maya ventured further, her smile began to fade. The vibrant murals she used as markers were nowhere to be found. Instead, gray walls loomed around her, unfamiliar and cold. Her little feet slowed as her confidence wavered. She paused in the middle of the sidewalk, her gaze darting left and right. Cars zoomed past, their tires splashing through puddles, and strangers brushed by her without a second glance. "Maybe I just missed a turn," she whispered to herself, trying to sound brave. She spun on her heel, clutching her backpack tighter, and retraced her steps. The buildings all looked the same now, tall, towering structures with blinking lights. The comforting smells of fresh bread and flowers had disappeared, replaced with the faint stench of exhaust and grime. Maya's breath quickened as a wave of uncertainty washed over her. Her little heart began to beat faster, pounding against her chest like a drum. She stopped walking, her small hands trembling as they gripped her backpack straps. The world around her suddenly felt bigger, noisier, and far less welcoming. Okay, she muttered, her voice barely audible. "It's fine. I just need to calm down and think." She remembered her father's advice again. Stay calm and retrace your steps. But every step she took seemed to pull her further into unfamiliar territory. The streetlights flickered on, their dim orange glow creating long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. The streets that had been full of people earlier were now thinning out. Those who remained walked quickly, their heads bowed, too lost in their own concerns to notice a little girl standing frozen in the middle of the sidewalk. Maya blinked back, the tears forming in her eyes. Her father always said tears wouldn't solve problems. "Stay strong, Maya. Be brave," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. She spun around and spotted an older woman walking briskly toward her. Relief flooded her chest. "Excuse me, ma'am," Maya called out, her small voice cutting through the hum of the city. "Can you help me? I think I'm lost." The woman barely glanced in her direction. Her face was impassive, her eyes cold and distant. Without breaking stride, she swept past Maya as if she didn't exist. Maya's hope shattered like glass. Her throat tightened and a fresh sting of tears pricked her eyes. She watched the woman disappear into the distance, her figure swallowed by the darkening streets. No, don't cry," Maya whispered, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her hoodie. "Tears won't help." Then she remembered her phone, her lifeline. Her father had given it to her for emergencies, and now more than ever, she needed it. With trembling fingers, she unzipped her backpack and dug inside, her hands fumbling through books and crayons. When her fingers finally wrapped around the cool, smooth surface of her phone, a small sigh of relief escaped her lips. "Yes," she whispered, pulling it out. Her fingers pressed the power button, and the screen remained black. "What?" "No," Maya muttered frantically, pressing the button again and again. The phone was dead. The battery had run out. Her vision blurred as tears spilled freely now, streaking down her cheeks. She hugged the phone tightly to her chest, her tiny body trembling. "Please," she sobbed softly, her voice lost in the noise of the city. "Please let me get home." The streetlights buzzed above her, their glow dim and unreliable. The once familiar streets had turned into a maze, and the sounds of the city had grown sharper, harsher. The occasional car passed by, its headlights cutting through the dark, but nobody slowed down. Maya's breaths came in shallow gasps as panic gripped her chest. What if she couldn't find her way home? What if she had to sleep on the street? What if something bad happened to her? "No," she said aloud, shaking her head. "I have to be brave." With resolve hardening in her little frame, she began walking again, her small legs moving faster despite the exhaustion pulling at her. She didn't know where she was going anymore, but she refused to stand still. She couldn't let the dark swallow her whole. The warmth of the day had disappeared entirely, replaced with a chill that seeped into her skin. The air felt heavy, and the city lights above seemed too far away. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, and her legs began to ache. Finally, when she couldn't walk any further, Maya spotted a small concrete bench near the edge of the sidewalk. She sank onto it, her little body curling up tightly. Her knees were pulled to her chest, and she wrapped her arms around them, trying to shield herself from the cold. She rocked gently back and forth, her tears still falling as she whispered to herself, "Please, Daddy, please find me." The street stretched out around her, empty and unforgiving. The shadows crept closer, the streetlights buzzed and flickered, and Maya felt smaller than ever. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of an engine broke through the silence. Maya's head snapped up, her eyes wide with hope. The low rumble of an engine echoed down the empty street, breaking the eerie silence that surrounded Maya. Her heart leaped with hope as she wiped the tears from her cheeks and sat up straighter. In the distance, a police car slowly rolled into view, its red and blue lights casting flashes of color onto the dimly lit buildings. "Police," she whispered with a surge of relief. "They'll help me." With renewed energy, Maya scrambled to her feet and waved her arms high in the air. "Help. Please, help me." Her small voice carried through the still night as she stepped closer to the street. The police car slowed, its engine humming steadily as it pulled to a stop just a few feet away. Maya stood frozen, her breath held tight in her chest as the driver's side door swung open with a heavy creak. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered. His uniform was crisp, his badge shining faintly under the flickering streetlight. His footsteps echoed ominously as he approached, the weight of his boots pressing heavily against the pavement. Maya squinted at the name on his badge. "Officer Markson." "Hey there, kiddo," Markson said, his voice deep and laced with an odd tone Maya couldn't quite place. "What are you doing out here all alone?" Relief rushed through her. Finally, someone who could help. She took a small step forward, her voice trembling but hopeful. "I'm lost," she said, clutching the straps of her backpack tightly. "I don't know how to get home. Can you help me, please?" Markson tilted his head, his expression shifting. The corners of his mouth curved into something that might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze scanned her from head to toe, lingering for a moment longer than it should have. "Lost, huh?" he muttered, his voice dropping just slightly. "Out here all by yourself?" Maya felt a shiver creep up her spine. Something about the way he looked at her, the way he spoke, felt wrong. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Trust your instincts, Maya. If something doesn't feel right, you get away." "I just want to go home," she said softly, her voice unsteady now. Markson let out a short, sharp laugh, and Maya flinched. "Home? Little girls like you don't belong out here. What were you thinking, huh? Wandering around at night?" Maya's heart pounded harder, each beat like a drum in her chest. "Please, sir," she tried again. "Can you call my dad? I have his number." Before she could finish, Markson took a step closer. She instinctively stepped back, her small frame trembling. "You think someone's coming for you?" he asked, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Out here? At this hour?" His words sliced through her confidence like a blade. Maya took another step back, her hands trembling at her sides. I didn't do anything wrong," she stammered. "Quiet." The command was sharp, almost like a hiss, and it froze Maya in place. Markson's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he reached out. Before Maya could react, his hand clamped tightly around her arm. "Let me go," she cried, yanking back as hard as she could, but his grip was like iron. Her small hands clawed at his wrist, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Stop squirming," he snapped, dragging her toward the nearby street lamp. His strength was overwhelming. No matter how hard she fought, she couldn't break free. "Please," she screamed, her voice echoing down the empty street. "Help me, somebody." But nobody came. Markson shoved her roughly against the cold metal pole of the street lamp. Maya's knees buckled, and her backpack slipped from her shoulders, falling to the ground with a soft thud. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she struggled to move, but Markson was already reaching for something on his utility belt. Her eyes widened in horror as he pulled out a roll of thick, silver duct tape. "No!" she screamed, thrashing wildly, but Markson was too strong. He ripped off a long strip of tape with a sharp snake and forced her arms against her sides, wrapping the tape tightly around her little body. "Stop," Maya sobbed, her voice breaking. "Please, I just want to go home." Markson ignored her. The tape pulled tighter with each pass, pinning her arms, her waist, and her legs against the pole. The rough edges of the tape bit into her skin, and she cried harder as the pressure grew unbearable. When he finally stepped back, he looked at his work with an air of satisfaction, his expression cold and cruel. "That ought to keep you quiet," he muttered. Maya's chest heaved with ragged breaths, her tears soaking the front of her hoodie. She twisted and squirmed, but the tape wouldn't budge. Markson stared at her for a long moment, his lips curling into a smirk. "You think someone's coming for you, huh? Hate to break it to you, kid, but nobody's coming." He turned his back on her and began walking toward the police car. "No," Maya sobbed, her voice hoarse from screaming. "Don't leave me here. Please." The engine roared to life as Markson climbed back into the driver's seat. Maya's eyes widened as the car's taillights glowed red, fading into the distance. And then he was gone. The street fell silent once more, save for the soft hum of the street lamp above her. Maya slumped against the pole, her body trembling violently as the cold air bit at her skin. The duct tape dug into her wrists, burning her with every slight movement. She glanced desperately down the empty street. Cars passed occasionally in the distance, but nobody stopped. Nobody noticed her. A group of teenage boys walked by on the opposite side of the road, their loud laughter echoing into the night. One of them turned his head and spotted her. He nudged his friend, and they both pointed at her, their laughter growing louder. "Help!" Maya croaked weakly, but her voice cracked. One of the boys pulled out his phone, snapping a quick picture before walking off with his friends, their laughter fading into the distance. Shame and despair washed over Maya like a tidal wave. Her sobs were quieter now, almost silent, as she slumped further against the pole. Her little hands tingled with numbness, and her legs burned from standing still. The shadows stretched around her, and the street grew darker with every passing minute. "Nobody's coming," Markson's words echoed in her mind. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, tears still leaking out as she whispered to herself over and over again. "Please, Daddy, please find me." The darkness seemed thicker now, pressing down on Maya like an invisible weight. The street lamp above her buzzed faintly, its dim glow flickering on and off as if it, too, was unsure whether to give up. The once busy street was now empty. The city, which had felt alive and bustling only hours earlier, had grown quiet and uncaring. Maya's small body trembled as she pulled against the layers of duct tape pinning her to the cold metal pole. Her wrists stung where the edges of the tape dug into her skin. She tried to twist her arms, push her shoulders forward, anything to loosen the relentless hold, but the tape wouldn't budge. Her legs ached from standing so long, and the chill of the night air seeped through her thin hoodie, making her shiver uncontrollably. Tears streamed down her cheeks, silent and endless. She didn't have the strength to scream anymore. Her throat was raw and sore from crying for help. "Somebody, please," she whispered weakly, her voice barely carrying beyond the soft hum of the street lamp. Her eyes darted around in the darkness, searching desperately for movement. Anything. Anyone. But the street remained quiet, as though the entire world had forgotten about her. The occasional car passed in the distance, its headlights sweeping across the sidewalk, but never stopping. A flicker of hope would ignite in her chest, only to be snuffed out when the car sped on without even slowing. Maya's breathing grew shallower as her mind began to spiral into dark, frightening thoughts. What if nobody finds me? What if I have to stay here all night? Her chest tightened as panic set in again. What if that man comes back? No, 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 she whispered to herself, shaking her head as if the movement could erase the thoughts. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out from the corners. Daddy's coming. He has to find me. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the street, and Maya's eyes shot open, her heart leaping into her throat. She craned her neck toward the noise, her breath catching as a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Markson. The man who appeared was older, his clothes ragged and stained. He shuffled slowly, his steps uneven and dragging as though walking took great effort. His beard was scruffy, his hair wild, and his shoulders hunched forward as he moved. "Help," Maya croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard, gathering what little strength she had left. "Please, sir. Help me." The man stopped, his head turning sharply toward her. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the little girl taped to a pole in the middle of an empty street. For a moment he didn't move. Maya's hope flickered, her gaze locked on him. Finally he took a few steps closer, his shoes scuffing against the pavement. His face was a mix of confusion and suspicion as he tilted his head, examining her like she was some strange illusion. "What's this?" he muttered to himself, his voice raspy and low. He glanced over his shoulder, as though checking for something or someone. "Some kind of prank?" "No," Maya said quickly, her voice cracking with desperation. "It's not a prank. Please, sir, I'm stuck. He taped me here and I can't get out. Please help me." The man's face twisted into uncertainty. He scratched his scruffy beard, his eyes darting from Maya to the darkened street around them. "Who did this to you?" he asked cautiously, his tone laced with distrust. Maya's lips trembled as she tried to speak. A police officer. Please, I just want to go home." At the mention of a police officer, the man's posture stiffened. His eyes swept the area again, a flash of fear crossing his face. "A cop?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. He took a step back, shaking his head. "Nope, not getting involved in that." Maya's stomach dropped. "Wait, please don't go," she cried, pulling against the tape with all her might. "Please, I'm scared. I just need help." But the man was already turning away, his hunched frame retreating into the darkness. "I don't want no trouble," he muttered over his shoulder, his voice hollow and final. "I ain't seen nothing." "No." Maya's voice cracked into a sob as she watched him disappear into the night. "Please come back. Don't leave me here." Bookmark, but he was gone. The sound of his shuffling footsteps faded into silence, leaving Maya alone once more. Her head slumped forward as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. The weight of hopelessness pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. She had called for help. She had begged. And still, nobody came. The cold air bit at her skin and her body ached from exhaustion. Her fingers tingled with numbness where the blood flow had been cut off. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the fear, the pain, the loneliness. Her lips moved in a silent prayer. "Please, Daddy," she whispered. "Please find me." Time felt strange now. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Maya's legs grew weaker with every passing second, and her mind drifted into a haze of exhaustion and fear. She blinked slowly, her eyes half closing as her body tried to give in to sleep. But every time she started to drift off, she would jolt awake with a gasp, her heart racing. The street lamp buzzed softly above her, its faint hum the only sound in the quiet street. The shadows stretched longer, darker, as though the night itself was swallowing her whole. Then, faintly, Maya heard something. At first she thought she was imagining it, a voice, distant but familiar. She held her breath, straining to listen. "Maya!" Her heart stopped. Her eyes flew open, wide and searching. The voice echoed again, louder this time. "Maya, where are you?" It was deep and strong, full of urgency and desperation. It was a voice she knew as well as her own heartbeat. "Daddy!" Maya cried, her voice breaking with relief. "Daddy, I'm here! I'm here!" Her father's silhouette appeared at the end of the street. Ethan Turner, a tall, broad man with powerful strides, was running faster than Maya had ever seen him move. His voice carried through the night, raw with fear and determination. "Maya, stay there! I'm coming!" Her sobs turned into gasping cries of relief. She could see him now, his face etched with worry, his eyes scanning the street until they locked onto her. In seconds, he reached her, dropping to his knees as his strong hands worked quickly to tear the tape away. "I'm here, baby. I'm here. I've got you." His voice shook as he muttered the words over and over, his hands trembling as he ripped the last layer of tape from her body. As soon as she was free, Maya threw her arms around him, burying her face into his shoulder. She sobbed uncontrollably, her small frame shaking against him. Ethan held her tightly, his chest heaving with every breath, his heart breaking at the sound of her cries. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," he whispered, his voice raw. "I'm here now. Nobody's going to hurt you ever again." Maya clung to him like a lifeline, her fingers clutching his jacket tightly. She felt safe. For the first time since that nightmare had begun, she felt safe. Ethan Turner held Maya tightly against his chest, his large hands trembling as they cradled her small, fragile frame. His heart was pounding in his ears, each thud a mix of relief and rage. He could feel Maya's tiny body shaking with silent sobs, her tears soaking into the collar of his coat. "You're safe now," he whispered, pressing his lips to the top of her head. "Daddy's got you." But his words, meant to comfort her, couldn't calm the storm boiling inside him. His daughter, his little girl, had been left alone, cold and terrified. He could still feel the faint stickiness of the tape on her hoodie as he held her close, a brutal reminder of what she had endured. His eyes scanned the dark, empty street, narrowing into sharp slits. Whoever did this would pay, there was no question. "Who did this to you, Maya?" he asked softly, his voice calm but laced with steel. He pulled back slightly so he could see her face, his rough fingers brushing the tears from her cheeks. "Tell me, baby girl, who did this?" Maya's lips quivered, her eyes still filled with tears. Her voice was barely a whisper as she clutched his jacket tighter. "It was a police officer." Ethan's entire body went rigid. The words hit him like a hammer, cold and sharp. For a moment, all he could hear was the wind rustling through the empty street. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. "A cop?" he said, his voice low and dangerous, as though testing to see if he'd heard her correctly. Maya nodded weakly, sniffling. "He said nobody was coming for me. He taped me here and left." Ethan closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths as he fought to rein in the overwhelming anger surging through him. His mind raced with questions. What kind of man would do this? A man sworn to protect? But there was no time for answers now. There was only action. Carefully, he scooped Maya into his arms, holding her close as he stood. Her small hands clung to the collar of his coat as though she was afraid he might disappear. "We're going home, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer now. "Mom's waiting for you." He walked briskly down the street, his boots crunching against the pavement with each determined step. The wind picked up, whipping through the empty roads and rustling the leaves scattered along the curb. But Ethan didn't notice. His entire focus was on his daughter and the fire of vengeance burning in his chest. When they reached the car, a dark SUV was parked near the corner. He opened the door carefully, setting Maya gently into the back seat. Her eyes were red from crying, her face pale and exhausted. "Sit tight. Okay, baby? I'm going to make a call." Maya nodded faintly, pulling her knees up to her chest as she curled into the seat. Ethan shut the door quietly before pulling his phone from his coat pocket. His hands were steady now, his movements precise and calculated as he scrolled through his contacts and pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. "Major Clark speaking." "Clark," Ethan said, his voice low but clear. "I need you to do something for me. Now." "Ethan?" Clark's voice sharpened immediately. "What's going on? I need a list of every officer on patrol in Zone 5 tonight," Ethan continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Badge numbers, names, and current locations. I want it in 15 minutes. There was a pause on the line, and when Clark spoke again, his voice was serious. "You know I don't ask questions when you sound like this, but what happened?" Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. He glanced back at Maya through the rearview mirror. She had her head resting against the window, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. The sight made his chest ache, and the fury surged hotter in his veins. "Someone put their hands on my daughter, Clark," he said quietly, each word clipped and precise. "A cop." The silence on the other end was heavy. When Clark finally responded, his tone was filled with the same hard edge. "I'll get you what you need." 15 minutes. Good, Ethan said, ending the call and slipping his phone back into his pocket. He climbed into the driver's seat, glancing back once more to make sure Maya was okay. She had closed her eyes now, her breathing steady but shallow. As he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turned white. His thoughts were razor-sharp, his focus absolute. This wasn't just about his daughter. This was about justice. Whoever had done this had not only broken the law, but had crossed a line that could never be crossed. He turned the ignition, and the SUV roared to life. The streets passed by in a blur as he drove, his face set in a hard expression of grim determination. The neon lights of the city flickered outside the windows, but Ethan saw none of it. His mind replayed the image of Maya tied to that pole, her face streaked with tears, over and over again like a nightmare on repeat. 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Ethan glanced at it briefly, then grabbed it without taking his eyes off the road. It was a text from Clark. Officer Jacob Markson. Zone 5, patrol duty, badge number 41382. Ethan read the name slowly, tasting the bitterness it left on his tongue. Markson. It wasn't just a name, it was a target. He turned the car sharply, heading straight for the police precinct. His every movement was deliberate and controlled, the same way he'd approached a battlefield during his years in the military. He was no longer just a father. He was a soldier on a mission. The police station loomed ahead, a cold, gray building with bright lights flooding the entrance. Ethan parked the SUV and sat still for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He looked into the rearview mirror one last time. Maya was sound asleep, her small frame curled up in the back seat. "Stay here, sweetheart," he whispered softly. "Daddy will be right back." He stepped out of the car, closing the door quietly. The night air was cold against his skin, but he didn't feel it. His coat billowed slightly as he strode toward the entrance of the precinct, his boots echoing against the pavement. The officers at the front desk looked up as he entered. They stiffened when they recognized him. Ethan Turner wasn't just a man. He was a presence, strong, commanding, and unyielding. "Where's Officer Jacob Markson?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of thunder. The young officer behind the desk swallowed hard. I think he's still in the locker room, sir." Ethan didn't wait for further instructions. He turned and strode down the hallway, his steps measured, deliberate. Every officer he passed moved aside without a word, their gazes dropping to the floor. They could feel it, the storm that had walked into their building. The locker room door loomed ahead. Ethan pushed it open without hesitation. The air inside smelled of sweat and metal. At the far end of the room, Jacob Markson sat on a bench, unlacing his boots. He looked up when he heard the door, his smirk faltering the instant his eyes met Ethan's. For a moment, the room was silent. "Officer Markson?" Ethan said softly, his voice cold as ice. Markson swallowed, the color draining from his face. "General Turner?" Ethan stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the floor as he closed the distance between them. "We need to talk," he said. The room felt colder as Ethan Turner stepped closer to Officer Jacob Markson. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting sharp, sterile shadows on the walls. Markson remained seated on the bench, his hands frozen halfway through removing his boots. For a moment, neither man moved. Ethan's presence filled the room, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow that loomed over Markson. His face was unreadable, calm and quiet, but his dark eyes burned with something far more dangerous than anger. It was the look of a man who had already decided how this would end. "General Turner," Markson said, forcing a nervous chuckle as he straightened his back. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." His voice carried an edge of mockery, but it was thin, like a layer of cracked glass. Ethan didn't respond. He took another step forward, closing the space between them. His boots thudded against the tiled floor, each sound deliberate and heavy. Markson's smirk faltered, and he looked away, his fingers twitching slightly as they rested on his knees. "Get up," Ethan said softly, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Markson frowned, his brows knitting together. "Excuse me?" Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "I said stand up." Markson hesitated, glancing around the empty room as if searching for an escape. He forced another grin, one that looked more like a grimace. "I don't know what you think is happening here, Turner, but you've got the wrong guy. I'm not. Stand up." The words were sharper this time, spoken with a command that made Markson flinch. Slowly, reluctantly, he pushed himself up from the bench, his movements slow and wary. He squared his shoulders, trying to look confident, but there was a nervous flicker in his eyes as he looked up at the man towering over him. "You think you can intimidate me?" Markson said, his voice louder now, trying to mask the tremor creeping into it. "This isn't the army, General. I'm an officer of the law. You don't get to come in here and throw orders around like you're still on a battlefield." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes narrowing. "A battlefield?" he repeated softly, his tone carrying the faintest edge of bitterness. "You wouldn't know the first thing about it." Markson's jaw tightened, but he didn't reply. Ethan took another step forward until they were inches apart. The air between them was thick with tension, every second dragging out like an eternity. "You put your hands on my daughter," Ethan said finally, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through stone. "You left her alone, tied up, terrified." Markson's eyes darted to the side. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, his voice defensive now. "You have no proof of anything." Ethan didn't blink. "I don't need proof. I have her word." Markson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His lips trembled faintly, and for the first time, the mask of arrogance slipped entirely. He took a step back, bumping into the row of lockers behind him. "You're scared," Ethan observed quietly, his voice deadly calm. "Good. You should be." Markson's breathing grew faster, his chest rising and falling in short, shallow bursts. "Listen, I didn't know she was your kid, okay? I didn't mean any harm. I was just messing around. It was a joke." Ethan's eyes darkened. "A joke?" he repeated slowly, his voice filled with quiet menace. "Does she look like she's laughing at you?" Markson's gaze flickered downward, unable to meet Ethan's unrelenting stare. "I made a mistake," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean for it to get out of hand." Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. "You think an apology is going to erase what you did?" Markson's shoulders slumped slightly, his confidence crumbling by the second. I have a family, man," he stammered. "Kids, just like you." At that, Ethan's jaw tightened, and his fists curled at his sides. He leaned in slightly, his face mere inches from Markson's, his voice a low growl. "Did you think about my daughter's family when you left her on that pole?" he asked, his tone dripping with icy rage. "Did you think about her crying for her father? Begging for someone to help her?" Markson's lips trembled, but he said nothing. "That's what I thought." Ethan straightened, his eyes locked onto Markson's with a predator's patience. For a long, excruciating moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then Ethan turned his head toward the doorway. "Arrest him." The words rang out like a gunshot. Two officers, who had been standing silently near the entrance, stepped forward. Their faces were grim, their movements quick and purposeful. Markson's head snapped toward them, panic flashing across his face. "Wait," he shouted, his voice desperate. "You can't do this. I'm one of you." The officers didn't respond. One of them grabbed Markson's arm, yanking it behind his back, while the other pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "No, this isn't right," Markson yelled, struggling as the metal cuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. "You're making a mistake. I have rights." Ethan watched silently, his expression unreadable. Markson thrashed against the officers, his voice rising into a frantic shout. "Turner, please, I'm sorry. Don't do this to me. I have a family." Ethan stepped closer, his dark eyes boring into Markson's as the officers held him in place. "So does she." Markson's face crumpled, and for the first time, real tears welled in his eyes. "Please," he whispered brokenly. "I didn't mean it. I swear." Ethan didn't flinch. "You'll have plenty of time to think about that in a cell." The officers began dragging Markson toward the door, his shouts echoing down the hallway. "You're ruining my life. You hear me? You'll regret this, Turner. I swear you'll regret it." Ethan didn't move as he watched Markson disappear through the doorway, his cries fading into the distance. He stood still for a long moment, his breathing slow and steady, his hands relaxed at his sides. Justice had begun. He turned and walked toward the exit, his boots thudding quietly against the floor. Outside, the night was still cold, but Ethan didn't notice. His mind was clear now, his resolve unshaken. As he reached the car, he glanced through the window at Maya, still curled up in the back seat, fast asleep. For a moment, the hard lines of his face softened. He opened the door quietly and climbed into the driver's seat. Maya stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. "Daddy?" she mumbled sleepily. Ethan reached back, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said softly. "It's over." Maya blinked up at him, her small face tired but calm. "You stopped him?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice was steady as he replied, "Yeah, baby. He won't ever hurt you again." Satisfied, Maya nodded faintly before resting her head back against the seat. Within moments, her breathing evened out and she was asleep once more. Ethan sat silently for a moment, staring at the road ahead. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts churning like a storm. Justice had been served, but this war wasn't over. Not yet. The drive home was quiet. The hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of tires against the road were the only sounds that filled the car. Ethan Turner kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white from the tight grip he held on the steering wheel. He stole a glance in the rearview mirror at Maya, who was still curled up in the back seat, her tiny chest rising and falling with steady, peaceful breaths. Ethan's heart ached as he watched her. For all the years he had spent preparing for battlefields and facing enemies, he had never imagined that the fight of his life would be to protect his own daughter, and from someone who wore a badge, no less. Go back. The streets grew quieter as they left the city's bright lights behind. The Turner family home sat nestled on a peaceful street at the edge of town, its white walls and welcoming porch a stark contrast to the horrors of the night. Ethan parked the car in the driveway, cutting the engine. He sat still for a moment, the silence wrapping around him. Turning slightly, he looked at Maya again. "We're home, baby girl," he said softly. Maya stirred, blinking groggily. Her big, tired eyes looked up at him, searching his face for reassurance. "Home?" she mumbled. "Yeah," Ethan nodded, a faint, reassuring smile breaking through the hard set of his jaw. "We're safe now." Ethan stepped out of the car and opened the back door. Maya's small arms immediately reached out for him. Without hesitation, he lifted her gently into his arms, cradling her like he had when she was still a baby. Her head rested against his shoulder, and for the first time that night she let out a soft, content sigh. The front door opened before Ethan reached the porch. Sophia Turner, Maya's mother, stood in the doorway, her face pale with worry, her hands wringing the hem of her sweater. Her breath hitched when she saw Maya, safe in Ethan's arms, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. "Ethan," Sophia breathed, her voice trembling. "What happened? Where was she?" "Inside," Ethan said firmly. "We'll talk inside." Sophia stepped aside, and Ethan carried Maya straight into the living room, where he laid her carefully on the couch. The little girl's eyes were already drifting shut again, exhaustion pulling her under. Sophia knelt next to the couch, brushing Maya's hair gently away from her face, her touch soft and loving. "Is she hurt?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head. "She's shaken up, but she's okay. She just needs rest." Sophia let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to Maya's forehead before covering her with a soft blanket. "Sleep, baby," she whispered. Ethan stood nearby, watching the two of them. The sight of Sophia comforting Maya brought some measure of peace to his heart, but it did nothing to quench the fire still burning in his chest. His mind replayed every detail of the night, Maya's trembling voice as she told him about Officer Markson, the duct tape pinning her to that cold metal pole, and the way her eyes had filled with terror. Sophia stood up, turning to face him. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice tight with emotion. "Who did this to her?" Ethan's jaw clenched. He looked at her, his expression hard and unyielding. "A cop," he said flatly. "Officer Jacob Markson." Sophia's face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth as she gasped. "A cop? Ethan, are you serious?" "I'm serious," Ethan said, his voice low and controlled, but every word vibrated with anger. He tied her to a pole and left her there, in the dark, alone. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God," she whispered, sinking onto the edge of the couch. She glanced back at Maya, her voice shaking. How could someone do that to a child?" "Because people like him think they can get away with it," Ethan replied, his voice a quiet growl. "But he won't. Not this time." Sophia looked up at him sharply. "Ethan, what did you do?" Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "I made sure he was arrested. He won't be hurting anyone else." Sophia stared at him for a long moment, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "And what now?" she asked quietly. "The news. The department. They're not just going to let this go." Ethan exhaled through his nose, running a hand over his face as he paced the room. "I don't care what happens next," he said finally, his voice steady but grim. "I'll take on the whole damn system if I have to. No one touches my family and gets away with it." Sophia nodded, wiping the tears from her face. She stood and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. "I know," she whispered, "but we need to be careful. We can't let this tear us apart." Ethan placed a hand on the back of her head, holding her close. For a moment, the weight of the night hung between them, unspoken but heavy. "We'll be fine," he murmured. "We're stronger than this." From the couch, Maya shifted in her sleep, her tiny voice murmuring something unintelligible. Both Ethan and Sophia turned to look at her, their arms still wrapped around each other. "She's so strong," Sophia said softly. "Stronger than any child should have to be." Ethan's eyes softened as he watched his daughter sleep. "She gets that from you," he said quietly. Sophia let out a small, sad laugh, shaking her head. "No. She gets it from us both." Ethan leaned down and pressed a kiss to Sophia's forehead. "Get some rest," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." Sophia hesitated for a moment before nodding. She gave Maya one last glance, then turned and disappeared down the hallway toward their bedroom. Ethan stayed behind, his eyes fixed on his daughter as she slept soundly. He sank into the armchair across the room, his body finally beginning to feel the weight of the night's events. He rested his elbows on his knees, running his hands through his hair as he let out a long, shaky breath. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. "Clark." Ethan swiped to answer. "Yeah, Ethan," Clark's voice came through, serious and clipped. "The footage from the station is already out. Someone leaked it. People are talking, man. It's all over the news." Ethan's brows furrowed. "What footage?" "The arrest." Markson shouting, screaming. "It's bad, Ethan. The department's scrambling and the media's already blowing this up." Clark paused. "They're calling you a hero." Ethan closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "I'm no hero, Clark," he said, his voice heavy. "I'm just a father." "Maybe," Clark replied, "but the world doesn't see it that way. You've set something in motion, Ethan. Be ready." Ethan ended the call and tossed the phone onto the coffee table. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as the weight of Clark's words sank in. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it was just the beginning. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to creep across the horizon, bathing the room in a soft, pale light. Ethan glanced back at Maya, who was still fast asleep. Her face was calm now, peaceful, as though the nightmare had finally left her. Ethan's jaw tightened, his resolve solidifying. No matter what came next, he would protect her. He would protect his family. At any cost. The first rays of dawn crept across the Turner family's living room, chasing away the darkness of the long night. Ethan sat in the armchair, his eyes fixed on the faint sunlight filtering through the curtains. His body was still, but his mind was anything but quiet. Maya remained fast asleep on the couch, her small form tucked under the thick blanket. Her breathing was soft and steady now, but the tear-streaked stains on her cheeks were still visible, a haunting reminder of what she had been through. The silence in the room was broken by the sudden buzz of Ethan's phone. He grabbed it from the table and glanced at the screen. It was Clark again. "Yeah?" Ethan answered, his voice low. "Turn on the news," Clark said without preamble. "It's spreading faster than wildfire. You need to see this." Ethan's jaw tightened as he grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. The screen flickered to life, and the sharp, professional voice of a news anchor filled the room. A shocking incident involving Officer Markson has sparked public outrage. Footage showing his arrest late last night has gone viral, drawing intense criticism of police conduct and demands for reform. The screen cut to the grainy footage taken inside the police precinct. It was shaky but clear enough to show Ethan confronting Markson, his face set in cold determination as he issued the order for the officer's arrest. Markson's shouts echoed in the clip as he was dragged away, his voice filled with panic and desperation. "You can't do this. You'll regret it. I have a family." The footage froze on Ethan's face, hard, unyielding, as the news anchor's voice returned. General Ethan Turner, a former military leader, personally intervened after his 9-year-old daughter, Maya Turner, was reportedly victimized by Officer Markson. According to sources, the officer allegedly restrained the young girl with duct tape and abandoned her in a dangerous area late at night. The incident has sparked widespread calls for justice and police accountability. Ethan's fingers tightened around the remote, his knuckles white as the report continued. Images of protest signs and social media screenshots filled the screen. The hashtag #JusticeForMaya scrolled across the bottom, already trending nationwide. Protests have already begun outside the police department, the reporter said, her voice serious. Citizens are demanding swift action against Officer Markson and reform to ensure incidents like this never happen again. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her face pale and tired. She crossed the room quietly, sitting down on the armrest of Ethan's chair. "Is this really happening?" she whispered, watching the screen. Ethan didn't reply. His eyes were glued to the television as the footage shifted to crowds of people gathering outside the police precinct, holding signs that read, "Protect, Don't Harm, and Justice for Maya." News crews filmed the growing crowd, their voices filled with anger and determination. "This is bigger than I thought," Sophia said softly, glancing at her husband. "It's everywhere, Ethan." Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. "Good." Sophia looked at him, surprised. "Good? People need to see this," Ethan replied, his voice calm but firm. "They need to know what kind of men are hiding behind badges." Sophia rubbed her arms as though trying to chase away a chill. "And what about us?" she asked quietly. "What happens to us now?" "To Maya. This isn't just about Markson anymore. It's about you too. They're calling you a hero." Ethan's expression hardened. "I don't care what they call me. I didn't do this for the cameras. I did it for her." He nodded toward Maya, who was still curled up on the couch, oblivious to the world. "They can say whatever they want. I'll take the heat." Sophia watched him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally she sighed and rested her hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Ethan. But this isn't over." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "Not yet." The TV screen flashed again, this time showing a mugshot of Jacob Markson. His face was pale, his eyes red and swollen, as though the reality of his situation had finally set in. Officer Markson is currently in custody, facing charges of child endangerment, misconduct, and abuse of power, the news anchor reported. The department has yet to issue a formal statement, but public pressure is mounting for swift action. Community leaders and activists have joined the growing protests, calling for accountability and systemic change within law enforcement. Ethan's phone buzzed again, this time with text notifications. He glanced at the screen. Messages from old military friends, local journalists, and people he didn't even know. Some were praising him. Others were asking for interviews. Sophia shook her head, watching the screen. "This is going to change everything." "Let it," Ethan said firmly. "It's time for change." Sophia looked at him, her expression torn. "And Maya? What about her?" "She doesn't understand any of this. She's just a little girl, Ethan." Ethan's gaze softened as he looked back at his daughter. Her small face was peaceful now, but the image of her tied to that pole haunted him like a shadow that wouldn't leave. "She won't have to carry this forever," he said quietly. "That's my job. I'll carry it for her." Sophia nodded faintly, though her worry didn't fade. "You're a good father, Ethan." Before he could respond, there was a soft knock at the front door. Ethan and Sophia both turned sharply toward the sound. Ethan stood, his posture immediately tense as he moved to the door. He peered through the peephole before unlocking it and pulling it open. Standing on the porch was a man in a crisp suit, holding a leather folder under his arm. His expression was neutral but serious. "Mr. Turner?" Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Who's asking?" "James Harrington," the man said, offering a small nod. "I'm a lawyer representing several families who've experienced similar incidents involving Officer Markson. I think we need to talk." Ethan stared at the man for a long moment, processing his words. "Similar incidents?" "Yes," James said gravely. "Your daughter isn't the first, but you might be the one who finally puts an end to this." Sophia appeared behind Ethan, her eyes widening as she listened. "Other families?" she whispered. James nodded solemnly. "What happened to your daughter has happened to others, but no one has spoken out until now." He looked back at Ethan. "We can help you, Mr. Turner, and you can help them." Ethan's jaw tightened as he glanced back into the house, his eyes settling on Maya. She was still sleeping, her face calm, unaware of the storm swirling just outside their door. He turned back to James, his shoulders straightening. "Come inside," he said. The lawyer stepped over the threshold, and Ethan closed the door behind him. Sophia watched her husband carefully as they sat down with James at the dining table. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at her, his expression set with unshakable resolve. "Now," he said, his voice steady and strong, "we fight." The dining room was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Ethan Turner sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed and his sharp eyes locked on the man seated across from him, James Harrington, the lawyer who had appeared at their doorstep. Sophia sat to Ethan's right, her expression a mix of exhaustion and curiosity, her fingers nervously toying with the hem of her sweater. James opened the leather folder he had brought, spreading a series of documents across the table. Photographs, names, reports. Ethan's stomach churned as he scanned the faces staring back at him, faces of other children, other families, and victims like Maya. "These are just a few of the cases," James began, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of anger. "Over the past 2 years, Officer Jacob Markson has been at the center of multiple incidents: abuse of power, excessive force, and intimidation. Most of the victims were children or young teenagers." Sophia's hand flew to her mouth as she gasped. "Children?" she whispered, her voice shaking. How could this happen?" James nodded grimly. Markson targeted the vulnerable, kids from low-income neighborhoods, children walking alone after school, and families who didn't have the resources or courage to fight back. He used his badge as a shield, knowing they wouldn't speak out. And when they did, he slid another document across the table, his eyes meeting Ethan's. Their cases were buried. Ethan's jaw tightened as he stared at the papers. Police reports stamped with words like unsubstantiated and closed without action. Some were missing pages. Others had been rewritten entirely. "They covered for him," Ethan muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "The whole damn department." James nodded again, his face grave. "This isn't just about one bad officer, Mr. Turner. It's about a system that let him operate unchecked for years." Sophia's voice trembled as she spoke. "And no one stopped him?" "Families tried," James said, his voice softening. "But they were intimidated, silenced, or dismissed. Some were threatened with legal action. Others simply gave up, too afraid to keep fighting. That's why this case is different." He looked directly at Ethan, his expression serious. "Because of you, Mr. Turner. Because you refused to back down." Ethan's fists curled on the table, his knuckles white. He glanced over at Maya, still asleep on the couch in the other room, her small frame nestled under the blanket. The thought of her enduring what those other children had faced, of anyone enduring it, sent a fresh surge of rage through his chest. "Markson's arrest is already making waves," James continued. "The footage of his handcuffing and your confrontation with him has sparked outrage. People are talking. Protests are growing. Families are reaching out to us, asking how they can join this fight. You've started something bigger than you realize, Mr. Turner." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "What do you want from me?" James didn't hesitate. "We want you to speak out. You and Maya are the center of this storm. Your story has a voice the world is finally listening to. If you come forward, if you tell them what happened, other families will follow. Together, we can take this to court. We can expose the cover-ups, hold Markson accountable, and force real change." Sophia turned to Ethan, her eyes wide with both fear and hope. "Ethan, what do you think?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the photos spread across the table, his mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours. Maya's tear-streaked face, her hoarse cries for help, and the cold, empty street where she had been left to suffer. He thought of the other children, their voices silenced, their stories buried. Finally, he exhaled deeply and looked at James. "What would this mean for my family?" James met his gaze squarely. "It won't be easy," he admitted. "The media will dig into your lives. The police department will push back. They'll call you a liar. They'll try to discredit you." He paused, his voice softening. "But you're not alone. We'll stand with you every step of the way. And so will the other families." Sophia placed a hand on Ethan's arm. "We can't let this happen to anyone else," she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. "Not after what they did to Maya." Ethan looked at her, the weight of her words settling in his chest. slowly. "We'll do it." James smiled faintly, a look of relief passing over his face. "You're making the right choice, Mr. Turner." He gathered the documents and slipped them back into his folder. "I'll set up a press conference for tomorrow. We'll prepare a statement. You'll have time to decide how much you want to say." Ethan nodded stiffly. "We'll be ready." James stood and extended a hand. Ethan shook it firmly, their eyes locking in silent agreement. "Thank you for trusting me," James said. "We'll make sure this story is heard." After James left, the house fell silent once more. Ethan sat back down at the table, his eyes drifting toward Maya. She stirred slightly on the couch, her small face peaceful now, unaware of the battle still brewing. Sophia sat down beside him, reaching for his hand. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "I'm sure," he said, his voice steady. "This stops now. Markson, the department, all of it. If we don't fight for her, no one else will." Sophia nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I just want her to feel safe again." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening. "She will," he promised. "I'll make sure of it." The rest of the day passed quietly. Maya slept for most of the afternoon, and exhaustion kept her under. Ethan stayed close by, keeping a silent watch over her while Sophia prepared meals she barely touched. The house felt like a bubble. Safe, but fragile, as though the world outside was waiting to burst through the walls. By evening, the sound of distant protests could be heard through the windows, chanting voices, the honk of car horns, and the occasional shout. Ethan stepped onto the porch, leaning against the railing as he looked toward the city skyline. A faint glow from the gathering crowd lit up the horizon, flickering like a storm on the verge of breaking. Sophia joined him, wrapping her sweater tightly around herself against the cool night air. "They're still out there," she said quietly, nodding toward the distant noise. "They're not stopping," Ethan replied, his voice low. "Neither am I." Sophia slipped her hand into his, offering him silent support. Together, they stood on the porch, watching as the glow of the city grew brighter and the voices of the crowd carried across the wind. Inside, Maya stirred awake on the couch. She rubbed her eyes sleepily and looked around the dim living room. "Mom? Dad?" she called softly. Ethan turned immediately, his heart clenching at the sound of her voice. He stepped inside quickly, kneeling beside the couch. "I'm right here, sweetheart," he said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Is it morning?" Maya asked groggily. "Not yet," Ethan replied, smiling faintly. "You're safe now, Maya. Go back to sleep." She nodded, her eyes drooping shut again. Ethan stayed with her until her breathing evened out, his large hand resting protectively on her back. Sophia watched quietly from the doorway, her heart aching at the sight. Their little girl had been through so much, but she was still here, still fighting, and they would fight for her until the very end. The following morning, the Turner household was awake before dawn. The air inside the house felt heavy, filled with the unspoken tension of what lay ahead. The faint sound of news broadcasts drifted from the living room television, where headlines about Maya's case continued to dominate. Phrases like "Justice for Maya," "Police accountability," and "General Turner speaks out" scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Ethan sat at the dining table, dressed in a simple black jacket and a crisp white shirt. His strong hands rested on the surface of the table, his fingers occasionally tapping against the wood as he stared at his phone. Messages and missed calls had poured in overnight. Friends, family, reporters, even strangers. Everyone wanted to hear his side of the story. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her expression both supportive and worried. She carried a cup of coffee, which she set down in front of Ethan before gently squeezing his shoulder. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Ethan looked up, his face calm but his eyes sharp and focused. "I have to be." Sophia nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "I'll get Maya ready. James said we don't need to take her to the press conference, but maybe she should hear what you have to say." Ethan frowned slightly, considering her words. "You think she's ready for that?" Sophia sighed. "She needs to know that you're fighting for her, that we're all fighting for her." Ethan nodded. "All right, bring her down." A few minutes later, Maya walked into the dining room, holding her mother's hand. She looked small and fragile in her oversized hoodie and leggings, her face still pale but showing signs of strength beneath the tiredness. She rubbed her eyes and looked up at her father. "Good morning, Daddy," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from the night before. Ethan's heart clenched, but he smiled for her sake. "Morning, baby girl. Did you sleep okay?" Maya nodded as Sophia helped her into a chair. "Yeah, are we going somewhere?" "No, sweetheart," Ethan said gently, crouching down beside her. "Mommy and I are going to talk to some people today, important people who need to know what happened to you." Maya's eyes widened slightly. "Is it about the bad man?" Ethan swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "Yes, baby, it's about him. But it's also about making sure he never hurts anyone else again." Maya looked at him for a long moment, searching his face as though trying to understand the weight of his words. Finally, she nodded. "Okay." Ethan kissed her forehead before standing up. "You stay here with Mommy, okay? I'll be back soon." Sophia smiled faintly and hugged Maya close. "We'll be watching you, Ethan. We'll be proud of you." Outside, the city was alive with tension. The streets near the police precinct were packed with protesters holding signs, chanting slogans, and waving banners that read things like, "Protect our children" and "Justice for Maya." The media had gathered in clusters, cameras set up and microphones ready, waiting for Ethan Turner to make his statement. Ethan's black SUV pulled up to the designated press area. He stepped out of the car, his tall figure immediately drawing attention. The crowd fell quieter for just a moment, as if recognizing the weight of the man who had arrived, a soldier, a father, and now a symbol of a fight much larger than himself. James Harrington was already waiting, his expression steady and reassuring. "Everything's set," James said, leaning in slightly to speak over the noise of the crowd. "When you're ready, step up to the podium. I'll handle questions after your statement." Ethan nodded silently, his eyes scanning the sea of reporters, activists, and protesters. He could hear snippets of their chants, "Justice for Maya," "Hold them accountable," and it filled him with both hope and determination. James gave him a final nod of encouragement. "Let's do this." Ethan stepped toward the podium. The crowd erupted with flashes of cameras, the clicking of shutters echoing like gunfire in his ears. Microphones from various news stations were thrust forward, waiting to capture every word. He gripped the edges of the podium, his expression calm but unwavering as he surveyed the crowd before him. The noise slowly died down, replaced by an expectant silence. All eyes were on him. Ethan took a breath, his voice steady as he began to speak. "My name is Ethan Turner," he said, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. "I'm a father, a husband, and a man who has served this country with honor. But today, I'm standing here not as a soldier, but as a parent whose 9-year-old daughter was betrayed by the very people sworn to protect her." The crowd murmured softly, the weight of his words settling over them like a blanket. "2 nights ago, my daughter, Maya Turner, was walking home when she was stopped by Officer Markson, a man who wears the same badge we're supposed to trust. Instead of helping her, he chose to humiliate her, to terrify her, and to leave her tied to a pole in the middle of the night. Alone, cold, scared." Ethan paused, his voice tight with emotion. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze steady and unflinching. "No child should ever have to endure what my daughter went through. No family should have to sit awake at night wondering if their child is safe. And no person, no matter their uniform, should ever be above the law." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd as some of the protesters clapped and shouted in support. "This is not just about my daughter," Ethan continued, his voice rising slightly. "This is about every child who has been failed by the people sworn to protect them. It's about the families who were silenced, the voices that were ignored, and the victims who were forgotten. It's about a system that has protected abusers like Officer Markson for far too long." Ethan's hands tightened on the podium. "But no more. Today we fight back. Today we demand justice, not just for Maya, but for every family that has suffered in silence. Officer Markson will face the consequences of his actions, and so will anyone who covers for him. This stops now." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising together in chants of support. "Justice for Maya! Justice for Maya!" Ethan stood still for a moment, letting the energy of the crowd wash over him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as he looked out at the sea of faces, families, protesters, and strangers who had come together, he knew they weren't alone in this fight. James stepped up beside him, gently patting his shoulder before taking over the podium to answer questions. Ethan stepped back, his shoulders squared, his face calm. He had said what needed to be said. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from Sophia. "We're so proud of you. Maya is smiling." Ethan's chest tightened, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He looked up at the horizon, the crowd still chanting in the background. For the first time in days, he felt hope. The fight wasn't over, but they were no longer alone. The sun had just begun to rise when Ethan Turner stepped back into his home. The light filtering through the curtains was soft and golden, casting gentle shadows across the living room. The morning felt different, calmer, as if the air itself had shifted after the storm of the previous day. Maya was still curled up on the couch, her small form wrapped tightly in the blanket. Sophia sat beside her, gently brushing her daughter's hair with her fingers. When she saw Ethan enter, her eyes softened and she offered him a faint smile. "How did it go?" she asked quietly, careful not to wake Maya. Ethan walked over, his shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. He sank onto the armrest of the couch, glancing down at Maya's peaceful face. "It went well," he said softly. "People listened. They're on our side." Sophia let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Good," she whispered. "It's about time." Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up, people walking their dogs, kids riding bikes, and the distant sound of a lawnmower humming somewhere down the street. It was as though the world hadn't noticed how everything had changed for their family. But Ethan knew better. The fight was far from over. Sophia looked at him, reading the unspoken thoughts on his face. "What happens now?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice was steady. "Now we keep going. Markson's arrest is just the start. The department's going to push back. They'll try to discredit us, spin the story, bury the truth. But we won't let them." Sophia nodded, her fingers absent-mindedly smoothing the blanket over Maya's shoulders. "You're right," she said softly. "We'll fight. For her. For every child they failed." Ethan looked at her, his gaze softening. "I couldn't do this without you, Soph." She smiled faintly, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "We're in this together. Always." At that moment, Maya stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked sleepily before looking up at her parents. "Daddy?" she mumbled, her voice still groggy. Ethan leaned down, brushing a curl away from her face. "Hey, baby girl. How are you feeling?" Maya rubbed her eyes with her small fists. "Better," she said softly, her voice stronger than it had been before. She glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on the morning light streaming through the window. "Is it a new day?" Ethan smiled faintly, his chest swelling with pride at her resilience. "Yeah, sweetheart. It's a new day." Maya sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chest. She looked at her parents, her big brown eyes full of quiet curiosity. "Did you stop the bad man, Daddy?" Ethan's face grew serious, but his voice was gentle as he replied, "Yes, Maya. He can't hurt you or anyone else ever again." Maya stared at him for a moment, her little face thoughtful. Then she nodded slowly, as though accepting his words. "Good," she whispered. "I don't want anyone to feel like I did." Sophia swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with tears. She wrapped her arms around Maya, pulling her close. "No one deserves to feel that way, baby," she murmured. "And because of you, maybe they won't have to." Ethan watched them silently, his heart full. Maya didn't realize it yet, but she had already made a difference. Her story had become a beacon, a call for justice that couldn't be ignored. And while the scars of the past would take time to heal, the Turners were stronger for having faced it together. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Sophia sat with Maya in the backyard. The sun was warm on their faces, the sound of birds chirping filling the air. Maya sat cross-legged on the grass, scribbling in a notebook with a collection of colored pencils scattered around her. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Sophia asked, leaning over to get a closer look. Maya held up her notebook proudly. "It's us," she said. On the page, a simple but colorful picture showed 3 stick figures standing together, a tall figure with broad shoulders, a smaller one with flowing hair, and a tiny one in the middle with curls. Above them she had drawn a bright yellow sun and a big rainbow stretching across the sky. Sophia smiled, her heart swelling at the sight. "That's beautiful, Maya," Is that our family? Maya nodded. Yeah, that's you and Daddy and me. And the rainbow means that the bad part is over. She pointed to the sun in the corner of the page, and the sun means it's happy now. Ethan's throat tightened as he looked at the picture. Maya's words were so simple, yet they carried a weight far beyond her years. He reached over and ruffled her hair gently. You're pretty smart, you know that? Maya giggled, her laughter light and carefree, a sound that Ethan hadn't heard in far too long. You always say that, Daddy. Because it's true, he replied, smiling. Sophia leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, watching Maya as she continued to draw. For the first time in days, peace seemed to settle over them. The world outside was still loud, with protests, media coverage, and debates about justice and accountability, but here, in their backyard, everything was quiet and still. You think she'll be okay? Sophia asked softly, her voice barely audible. Ethan looked at his daughter, who was now carefully coloring in a rainbow with a purple crayon. Yeah, he said quietly. She's stronger than any of us. Sophia smiled faintly. She gets that from her dad. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. She gets it from both of us. They sat together in silence, the warmth of the afternoon wrapping around them like a blanket. Ethan knew the fight wasn't over. The days ahead would be difficult. The court hearings, the interviews, the pushback from those who wanted to bury the truth. But as he watched Maya laugh and scribble her colors onto the page, he knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. That night, as the sky darkened and stars began to dot the horizon, Ethan tucked Maya into bed. She clutched her favorite stuffed bear tightly as she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. Are you staying with me, Daddy? She asked softly. Ethan sat down on the edge of the bed, brushing a curl away from her face. Always, he said, his voice steady. I'll always be here. Maya's lips curved into a small smile as she closed her eyes, her breathing evening out as she drifted to sleep. Ethan sat there for a long time, watching her, his heart finally at peace. He stood slowly, turning off the lamp and leaving the door slightly cracked as he stepped into the hallway. Sophia was waiting for him, her arms crossed and a tired but content smile on her face. She's asleep? Yeah, Ethan replied, exhaling deeply. Sophia reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. Together, they walked toward the living room, where the soft glow of the evening light cast long shadows on the walls. Outside, the world continued to turn, noisy, chaotic, and uncertain. But inside, in the quiet of their home, they were safe. And for now, that was enough. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Did it inspire you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Type 1 if it moved you, or 0 if it didn't. Your feedback means the world to us and helps bring more meaningful stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful story, and feel free to share your own experiences. Let's keep the conversation going.